Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/spookshow. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Sometimes here on the All-American Spook Show Horror Podcast, we pause to focus on the masters, subjects, and icons that make the horror genre so great. So join us this week for the Spook Show Spotlight. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of the All-American Spook Show Horror Podcast. I am Josh and I'm joined here with Donnie.
Hey.
And the Professor Smoke.
What's up?
Will couldn't be with us. He's on assignment as per usual, but we actually have a special guest here in quote-unquote studio here today. We're talking over Zoom, but we have film historian, author Paul Talbot. Smoke, I'll kind of let you introduce him a little bit since you kind of brought him to the table, like what you guys, your history together, and or you know at least your past or whatever, where you rubbed shoulders in the past.
We met through, there's a filmmaker in the Columbia area named Christopher Bickle, and Chris used to put on at this local downtown movie theater, independent movie theater, something called Lowbrow Friday, or First Friday Lowbrow Cinema, which was the first Friday of every month he would play a grindhouse exploitation type film. He did that for a number of years. And one of those movies, the first movie I believe that I met Paul on was he's a friend of Chris's, and Chris had brought Paul in to do the intro, to introduce the movie and talk about the movie a little bit, 10 to Midnight. I believe that was the first one. And then after that was Exterminator 2, I believe. 2 Canon films, of course. Paul had an interesting intro and interesting props, shall we say, for the 10 to Midnight movie. That was a great intro. It was pretty funny with that. But yeah, I'll let Paul come on. And so that's our history together. And then, like I said, Christopher Bickle's kind of that. He went on to do filmmaking himself now. He doesn't do the First Friday lowbrow cinema thing anymore because he went on to do bigger and better things as far as writing and directing and producing movies. So
basically kind of what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about Charles Bronson mostly, but we'll also be talking about Canon films, what you love and hate, I guess, about Canon films, because I'm sure everybody's got the love-hate thing going with Canon, or mostly love, probably most of us, I guess. But we'll talk a little bit about that, but in particular we'll talk about Charles Bronson, I guess, with you, because you actually wrote you said 2 books about Charles Bronson, right? About his career in life.
That's right. Yeah, I've written 2 books. The first one was called Bronson's Loose, The Making of the Death Wish Films. And for that book, I covered all 5 of the Death Wish films. I interviewed many of the directors, writers, producers, actors. And that book did pretty well for me. I enjoyed doing it. And then I guess about 5 years later, actually it was close to 10 years later, I did a follow-up, which was called Bronson's Loose Again, on the set with Charles Bronson. And for that one, I covered the movies that he made after the original Death Wish. And again, what I tried to do with all of that is to interview as many of the producers, directors, writers, actors that I could find who were still alive. And that's what's very important. We have to find these people and talk to them while they're still alive before they pass away, before we lose their stories. And I was very fortunate that a lot of them spoke to me, because many of the people that I spoke with have passed on since then. So it was very important to capture these stories while these people were still alive.
Yeah, that's cool, though. What is your history with Charles Bronson, other than just being a huge fan?
Right. I came up, I grew up in the 1970s, a very good time for movie fans. I grew up in a town called Beverly, Massachusetts. There was a theater that I could walk to. Back then, the movies would open in the big cities, and then a few months later, they would play in the smaller theaters as double features. So when I was in the 1970s, watched a lot of movies on TV, my mother and I would always watch the Elvis Presley movies. And one day we watched one called Kid Galahad, in which Bronson plays a boxer. Charles Bronson plays his trainer. That was the first time I saw Charles Bronson, very intrigued by him. And then a few days later, my father and I watched my father's favorite movie, which was The Great Escape, early 1960s, 1963 movie about, it's a World War II film. Charles Bronson is one of the main characters in that. So seeing those two movies very quickly made me a lifelong fan. And then the first movie I saw in the theater in 1975, Bronson movie called Breakout, I was able to walk to the movie theater and see that film. So that era then made me a lifelong Bronson fan.
I guess fast forward along the way here, did you ever have a chance to meet Charles Bronson?
Yeah, unfortunately not. I never had a chance to meet him in person. And then once I started writing things, I was never able to get an interview with him. By the time I started getting into doing research and interviewing people, he unfortunately was in stages of Alzheimer's. So he was very reclusive anyway. I don't know if he would have talked to me anyway, but long story short, no, I unfortunately was never able to actually interact with Charles Bronson myself.
Yeah, because I think he passed in 2003, I think it was, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Hey, that sucks. That would have been cool to. He would have been a cool one to meet for sure.
Right.
But at least you got to talk to a lot of the people that he worked with and everything like that. So that's kind of cool, like an extension of kind of getting to meet him, right?
Right. Trying to kind of like piece his life story together, not through him, but through the people that knew him.
Oh yeah. Well, as far as now this question doesn't necessarily pertain. Well, it might end up referencing Charles Bronson, but I was going to ask you, Paul, what was your first Canon Films movie that you saw, whether that be in the theater or on tape or whatever?
Okay. Yeah. I'm a huge Canon fan. I was a huge Canon fan starting back in the day. I used to, of course, see a lot of the movies in the theater, then rent them on videotape. And it was a while before I started realizing what Canon was. So I probably, looking back, must have been, I think, Schizoid, which is with Klaus Kinski.
Oh, yeah.
I saw that one on television. I think I saw that one on late night on HBO. So I think that was probably the first one. And then when I first started realizing who they were, when they started getting publicity, I guess Death Wish 2, I saw that in a movie theater. So I think that was probably, I guess, the first one I saw in a theater. And then, of course, once I recognized that famous Canon logo, when I would see that in the beginning, then I became a fan and started realizing that hey, this Canon, this is a company that puts out a lot of interesting movies. And of course, one important thing is this was before the internet. Nowadays, we know every single movie that's coming out. We can research every movie coming out. Back then, we didn't. There was more of a mystery about these things. There was like these trade magazines you could find, but there wasn't too much of mainstream stuff. So there was a mystery about these different movie theaters, these smaller movie theaters.
Yeah, me growing up during that time period, I maybe came along a little bit later. It was 83, I saw Breaking in the theater. It was the first one I saw in that era. I don't know if it was, I didn't notice that I noticed there was a difference in these movies, and I love Canon films, but I didn't really notice that. I didn't put it together that how they were like low budget and coming in. I mean, it came out of the Hollywood system, so they were running right up against other Hollywood movies. I never thought of, these are just, kind of cheeseball action movies. I just saw them in the same light as I saw any other Hollywood movie at the time.
Right.
But they were definitely different, had action packed and everything.
Right. And then those early ones, of course, Breakin' was their biggest hit. That one, of course, played everywhere. That had a major distributor putting it out. And as you said, they were, these were not, they had good budgets to them. So they certainly were, the early ones certainly were comparable to pretty much any other action movie ever made. And Breakin', of course, was a big hit. And that was an important movie at the time because that did actually capture a lot of the culture that was going on. There was before, it was still when break dancing was first coming out.
Oh, yeah.
So that movie really did capture a lot of the authentic street culture and the fashions of the time.
And what I thought was interesting about it later, after the fact, was that most of those movies, well, that was really one of the first ones that came out, but some of the ones that came out directly after that were set in New York. And most of them were in New York. So you get most of that New York culture from the other movies, but you don't get too many LA ones. And that was what was interesting about it, I thought, too. Seeing the LA side of that.
Especially like those New York settings in those movies in the late 70s and early 80s where it's like before they cleaned New York up. So like all those movies just kind of grimy. The one calling card
the whole 42nd Street and everything.
The one calling card I always noticed with like Canon films is like maybe it's just me, I don't know, that there's always like somewhat of a glow to it. Anybody else ever notice that? Like when you're watching, like that's kind of like maybe not every single one of them, but most of them, there's like this weird kind of haze glow
You
to the movies.
Yeah, I don't know. Lighting, their lighting design. I'm not so sure about cinematography, like how if they had any sort of cinematographers that followed, in-house Canon cinematographers or not.
Mm-hmm.
And there were quite a few of the regular directors of photography that they used. And one thing Josh was saying, I know what you're saying, kind of that hazy look, that was popular in the 1980s in the movies and very much so in the music videos that used to be on television.
Mm-hmm.
They would use a lot of bright colors. They would put like the plastic gels in front of the camera to give that bright, colorful look. And they would also do kind of like use a smoke machine. They would put a smoke machine and then, fan it so it would kind of dissipate, but that little bit of haziness was still there. So that's kind of like what Josh was saying. That was that. Like you said, kind of like almost like a halo, kind of like a glow type effect.
I actually did have a question. As a former filmmaker, I freelanced for about 5 years, but then just kind of life called. But no, like, how'd you get into film history? Like, what's like, I guess, kind of more of your background?
Yeah, it was kind of like, when I was a little boy, I used to watch the movies and the TV shows, and then you become fascinating saying, how did this get made? How does it get put together? These people in these movies, of course, they're not really these characters. What are they like? How do these things happen? How do the special effects happen? So just trying to find out what was going on behind the scenes is what led me to becoming a film historian. And again, back then when I started, we did not have the internet. I had to, go to the actual physical library. You'd go to a section of movie books, pluck them off the shelf and flip through them, trying to find something that would answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
That would answer the questions I had.
So you almost had to kind of, if you really were into a particular subject like such as that, you almost had to kind of become a historian of it, because you would have to do so much research and stuff, right? Like you just kind of have to dive into it a little harder.
Yes, absolutely. You had to, nowadays, if we think of a movie, we just whip out our phone, pull up Wikipedia, and any movie ever made, you can find a little story that answers all your questions instantaneously. Whereas back then, there was newspapers, of course, but newspapers were the older newspapers were hard to find. Now, of course, all those newspapers are now online, and that's fantastic for me because I can find these newspapers from decades ago that used to be thrown away. Now all that history is now not only preserved, but at our fingertips.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're probably a cult movie fan, of course, and as well as a horror fan. And speaking on that, the fact of, how easy it is now with the internet and how it used to be, just going to the video store, trying to scour the shelves to find certain things like Italian horror movies, for instance. I got big into Italian horror movies back in the 80s, and just trying to figure out what movie might even be an Italian horror movie, because you couldn't tell. So they try to Americanize everything, make it not look like a foreign film. So, you look for Lucio Fulci films, and, here's one by this guy named director Louis Fuller.
Right.
Maybe. So it was a lot of like hunting movies that way. And you might find some other name that looked familiar to you, and you would get it on a whim, or, you scour the pages. I'd get Fangoria or later Gorzon magazine, and you get columnists like, as we've mentioned on the show, Chaz Balin or somebody who's feeding you some of this information, then you can go to the store and look for it. And there was something about that. Now it's great having everything at your fingertips now to be able to look up stuff, but there was something to be said for that old school way of doing it.
Yeah, that was fun because it was like almost like mysterious in a way. Because like you said, you would go to the video store and you would see this great artwork and maybe a few pictures on the back, but you had no idea what this thing was. And a lot of times you couldn't even tell what year it was made. So you would just take your chance and go home and watch it. And sometimes it would be something awful, but a lot of times be something fantastic. And like you said, you'd see a familiar face. You're like, where did I see that woman before? Or where did I see that guy before? And so we would have to, what I used to do, I would watch a movie. I would write down a little synopsis, write down the director and the writer and the actors I recognize. And you could kind of piece a history together that way. Also fun going to the movies back then when we went to the drive-ins and the grindhouses. Again, there was movies that we didn't know who made them, and you would always find some strange, a little gem, a movie that you didn't know was going to be good or bad, but it turned out to be something good, something that we would remember. And that's why the Canon movies were a lot like that. You would see a lot of actors, like the supporting actors, from movie to movie.
Why fuss and fret about dinner? Why not have it right here? Yes, this drive-in offers everyone in the family a real picnic treat for dinner. We've got delicious sandwiches with all the trimmings and your other dinner favorites, plus whatever you want to drink, hot or cold. Come early before the show starts, or eat while you're being entertained, or at intermission time. So why fuss? Give your family a tasty dinner at this drive-in.
And speaking of grindhouses, the very theater that I met Paul in, when he introduced the first Friday lowbrow movie of 10 to Midnight and Exterminator 2, it's called the Nickelodeon Theater in downtown Columbia, but it used to be the Fox Theater, and it was a grindhouse back in the 80s, and I don't know how far back it went as far as being a grindhouse or not.
Yeah, the Fox was on, like Brian said, Main Street in Columbia, South Carolina. It was a first-run theater, very nice, had a balcony, a great big screen. You could sit on the downstairs or sit in the balcony. And then, of course, as time goes on with television, it became a grindhouse where they would show the lesser-known movies, a lot of karate movies, action movies, horror films. And I used to go there when I was a teenager because, again, a lot of this stuff hadn't been on television yet. So that's where I would see a lot of the grindhouse-type movies. I saw a lot of the Canon films there, Body and Soul, Exterminator 2, a lot of the Canon movies I saw then. And that would be, and what they actually did, then they put like a floor separating the bottom level from the balcony and put a second screen. So it became a 2-screen theater, whereas it was originally a 1-screen elegant theater.
So that one they actually did like kind of cut it in half and did like a 2-story kind of thing.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Because
right.
A lot of times you would see it like they take one theater and cut it down the middle and like make one screen over here, one screen over here.
Right. That's what they used to do when it was, when there wasn't a balcony, right, they would put a wall in between and make 2 theaters side by side. But the Fox was one, it had a balcony, so they built a floor in between the balcony and the bottom and cut the screen in that way. Yeah, that was fun because, of course, nothing beats, watching these movies together. Of course, we can do that at home. You can have some buddies over watching the movie that way. But that was a fun series because, we had a whole bunch of people, strangers getting together watching these crazy movies. Some had seen them before, some had never seen them before. So that was a really good time. Yeah. It was really, it's good that we get to do stuff like that, come together as a community type thing and watch one of these movies. So that was a really
was always a good time.
I treasured that time. That was a good series. Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about that before. Like certain movies need to be kind of watched like that. Like it's like you said, it's fun to watch them on your own, maybe with a few buddies and a couple beers or something. But it's really cool when you're in a room full of like-minded people watching, the same thing and everybody just kind of, enjoying it together. So I guess, was there anything like you wanted to kind of go down through, like about Charles Bronson or anything? Any interesting tidbits or anything? Since we're going to be talking more about Canon films. But probably not in particular too much about Charles Bronson, at least until we do the 10 to Midnight episode. So is there anything maybe you can add about 10 to Midnight or just Bronson's career leading up to that or anything like that that we can use, know going into 10 to Midnight?
Yeah, well, Bronson came from absolutely nowhere. He came from a family of coal miners, and he got drafted into the Army during World War II, and when he came out of World War II, he used the GI Bill to go to acting school, studied acting, and started at the bottom, played mostly tiny bit parts, worked his way into a supporting actor. And then when he was well into his 40s, he went over to Europe and started starring in some movies over there, became a huge star over in Europe, and was pretty much still unknown in the United States. And then eventually started making some movies that were big in the United States as well. So there was a time when he was the biggest movie star in the world. And then he made Death Wish, which was the first movie, actually the only movie that was a huge hit in the United States. He had some hits in the United States, but Death Wish was the only one that was an actual bona fide blockbuster. and then he became one of the most popular movie stars in the world. And one thing that's good is that he's maintained his cult following. One thing that's interesting, it's kind of like music. Sometimes there'll be a band that's really huge and then they'll stay huge, but like Led Zeppelin, they were huge when they started. They're still huge. They keep building a new audience. Movies and actors are the same way. Some actors are huge when they come out, then they're kind of forgotten. Same with some movies. Sometimes movies are huge hits and then they're forgotten. But one interesting thing about Bronson is his cult perpetuates. I go to a lot of these movie conventions and I see a lot of very young people, young men in their 20s, and they'll have a Bronson t-shirt on, or some will even have a Bronson tattoo. So, his cult is continuing with a younger audience.
That's dedication, man. You get any person tattooed on yourself, that's not like a family member or something like that. That's dedication.
Right.
But I guess it's unsurprising though, as like you said, is kind of a cult following and as popular as Charles Bronson has become. So is there any interesting things you can tell us about 10 to Midnight before we watch it? And here, well, I think we're going to be watching it next week. So anything, maybe some background information or anything interesting you can point out, so we can use that for that?
Yeah, 10 to Midnight, released in 1980. It's 82 or 83. I'm drawing a blank right now. That one was interesting because it was originally based on the Richard Speck murders. Richard Speck had murdered some women, some nurses in the 1960s. It was a horrible event. And that started as a story about that. And then they got the script, got the idea that they have a police detective who's pursuing this serial killer. So several different serial killers inspired it. Also, J. Lee Thompson, who directed and created 10 to Midnight, he didn't want the serial killer to be sleazy looking like Richard Speck. He wanted him to be looking more like Ted Bundy, somebody who would not frighten the women, somebody the women would find to be attractive. So that's why the serial killer became attractive in that film. And 10 to Midnight, at this point, Bronson was well into his 60s. But 10 to Midnight was a really up-to-date, sleazy, slasher-type movie with a lot of nudity, a lot of violence, a lot of shocking material. So that one introduced Bronson to a new audience. 10 to Midnight wasn't that big a hit when in the theaters. I think partly because it didn't have a very good ad campaign. The poster just made it look like another Charles Bronson action movie. And of course, the kids weren't really into that at the time. But 10 to Midnight played on HBO and was one of the biggest hits that year on HBO. People who watched it were shocked and were like, what is this? So a lot of older male fans saw 10 to Midnight and that rekindled their interest in Charles Bronson. And a lot of younger fans, mostly younger male teenagers, men in college age, that was the first Charles Bronson movie they saw. So that started them as being Charles Bronson fans. And that was Bronson's second film for Canon was 10 to Midnight. And after that, he got a multi-picture deal with them and made a whole bunch of those sleazy action-type films for Canon. So the Canon era introduced Bronson to a whole new audience. And one interesting thing about that, like I said earlier, Bronson started acting in the early 1950s. In the early 1960s, in the 50s and 60s, he had some supporting movies and a lot of films that are now considered classics. Then in the late 1960s, he started starring in films made over in Europe. And then in the 1970s, started starring in films made in the United States. And it's interesting because some Bronson fans like myself enjoy all of his work, watch his films from every single era, whereas some other people will only like the films that he was a supporting actor in. Some will only like the European films he were in, and some will only like the Canon film. So it's interesting that he has these different levels of cult following.
He randomly pops up in a lot of old TV shows and stuff too, like old westerns and episodes of random shows like Bonanza or something, right?
Yeah, he was in many TV episodes. In fact, some of the best stuff he did was on television in the 1960s. He played a villain a lot. There's an early Gunsmoke episode. He plays a villain in that. He's fantastic in that. He was a regular in a couple of series in the 1960s. So, as you said, he was in many, many films and television shows before he became a star. So he always popped up on television. In fact, in the 1970s, when I was growing up, when he was at his height of popularity in the movies, they would say on TV, they would actually announce that they would, an older movie that has supporting part in, they would say starring Charles Bronson, making it look like he was the main figure. Or they'd be like, tonight's episode of Bonanza, special guest star Charles Bronson. They would promote it that way if he was in the episode. So.
In the meantime, it's just a small supporting role, and he's barely in it. You know,
usually yes, quite often, right?
They're just selling his name.
And also, Paul, if you wanted to plug somewhere, where I know you can get the books from Amazon, I believe, but anywhere you want to, anything you want to put out there as far as where you can get your books from or anything like that.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the books are Bronson's Loose. The books are Bronson's Loose, The Making of the Death Wish films, which covers the 5 Death Wish films. I interviewed many of the people involved with those films. The second book is called Bronson's Loose Again, On the Set with Charles Bronson. Again, both those books are filled with pictures, the story behind the film. I describe how every film was created, how it was made, how it was received. So try to make them very entertaining books. And they're all available any place you can buy books. Of course, Amazon.com, as always, is probably the most efficient way to get it. You can find it at Amazon.com. Find both of those books. I've also done commentary tracks for many Bronson films and those for the Bronson Blu-rays. And again, you can find those Amazon.com. Any place that makes Blu-rays, you can find those.
All right. Well, like I said, we thank you for coming on. And just a tease for next week, like I said, we're going to be watching the Charles Bronson classic 10 to Midnight. We talked about it there with Paul during the episode, but I'll go ahead and read you the IMDb synopsis because it's very simple, one sentence. An LAPD detective and his rookie partner are on the trail of a psychopathic young man who is murdering young women. Directed by J. Lee Thompson. So there you go. That is from 1983. Like you said earlier in the episode, you were wondering whether it was 82 or 83. That is 83. But come back next week for that, and we'll see what we'll actually have Paul's thoughts on 10 to Midnight, and we'll give him a chance to give a star rating on that one. So for Will and Donnie and the Professor Smoke, I'm Josh. We are the All American Spook Show Horror Podcast, and we'll talk to you next week.
As you leave the theater, folks, please be careful. Don't let this happen to your car. Be sure to remove the speaker before you leave. If you should accidentally pull a speaker loose, please turn it in at our snack bar or box office. Thank you.